Sleep never came that night. The room was quiet, but his mind wasn't. The clock on the wall kept moving forward, second by second, reminding him that time did not care how exhausted he was. Every muscle in his body felt heavy, yet his thoughts refused to slow down. Orders echoed in his head, short, sharp, final. There was no room for hesitation. He had been awake for more than 30 hours. Coffee no longer worked. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed them together, trying to steady himself. Outside the room, others waited. They trusted him. They expected clarity, confidence, certainty. What they didn't see was the weight behind his eyes. Fatigue does something dangerous to the mind. It blurs lines that once felt obvious. It turns simple choices into impossible ones. And that night, exhaustion wrapped itself around his judgment like fog. The command had come late. Too late. No time to rest. No chance to reset. Just a directive and the quiet pressure to act. Make the call. That was all they said. He stared at the map in front of him. Symbols, routes, numbers, things he normally read without effort now felt distant, unreal. He blinked hard, forcing focus. Lives depended on this decision, not ideas, not theory. Real people, real consequences. His body begged for sleep, but the situation demanded action. He thought about delaying. Just a few hours. Just enough rest to clear his head. But delay carried its own risks. Waiting could be interpreted as weakness. Worse, it could be seen as defiance. And defiance was never forgiven. Command pressure is rarely loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It sits quietly in the background, reminding you of expectations, reputation, and responsibility. It whispers, you are the one in charge. Do not fail. He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Images flickered behind his eyelids, past decisions, past mistakes, faces he never forgot. Some outcomes he was proud of. Others still followed him in silence. When he opened his eyes again, the clock had moved forward. Time was running out. He signed the order. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music, no speech. Just a pen moving across paper, guided by a hand that hadn't slept and a mind stretched too thin. The decision was made not with confidence, but with necessity. And once it was done, there was no taking it back. The hours that followed passed in fragments. Updates came in pieces. Partial information. Conflicting reports. Each one tightened the knot in his chest. Fatigue made it harder to process what he was hearing. He replayed the decision over and over, searching for flaws he might have missed. Sleep deprivation is cruel like that. It doesn't just slow you down, it makes you doubt everything. When the final report arrived, he didn't react right away. He read it twice, then a third time. The outcome wasn't perfect. It never is. But it wasn't a disaster either. Still, relief didn't come. Because deep down he knew something uncomfortable. If he had been rested, truly rested, would he have chosen differently? That question stayed with him long after the night ended. Later, when the world moved on and the urgency faded, people talked about the decision like it had been made in a vacuum. They analyzed it with calm minds and clear eyes. Some praised it. Some criticized it. None of them mentioned the exhaustion. None of them mentioned the 30 hours without sleep. None of them mentioned the quiet pressure of command. But that night taught him something that never left him. Human weakness doesn't disappear with rank or responsibility. It hides behind discipline. It waits for moments of fatigue. And when the world demands perfection from someone who hasn't slept, even the strongest minds can bend. Sometimes, history turns not on strategy or strength, but on a decision made by someone who was simply too tired to think clearly. Morning arrived without relief. The light through the window felt harsh, almost accusing. He hadn't slept, not really. Just fragments. 10 minutes here, 5 there. Enough to dream, not enough to rest. His body felt hollow, like it had been drained overnight. The decision was already moving forward. There was no undo button, no pause. Systems were in motion, people were acting, and the weight of it all pressed heavier now than it had in the dark. Fatigue changes after sunrise. At night, exhaustion feels like survival. In the morning, it feels like judgment. He washed his face with cold water, staring at his reflection. The person looking back seemed older than yesterday. Not by years, by responsibility. His eyes were red. His expression stiff, controlled, practiced. Outside, others were already talking about outcomes. Speculating. Predicting. Assuming. They spoke with the confidence of people who had slept. Reports continued to arrive. Each one added detail the night had lacked. Information he would have killed for hours earlier. Context, clarity, nuance. Too late now. He read quietly, absorbing every line. His mind tried to rebuild the moment. If I had known this, if I had waited, if I had rested. The thoughts stacked up, one after another, until he forced himself to stop. Regret is loud when you're tired. The truth was uncomfortable. The decision hadn't been wrong, but it hadn't been clean either. There were costs. There always are. But today, those costs had names, faces, and consequences that no briefing ever fully captures. Command pressure doesn't end once the order is given. It shifts. Now the pressure came from above and below. From those asking why certain choices were made. From those asking why others weren't. From people who wanted simple explanations for complex moments. Why didn't you delay? Why didn't you adjust? Why didn't you see this coming? He answered carefully, calmly, professionally. But inside, the answers were tangled in one unavoidable fact. He had been exhausted. No one wants to hear that. Fatigue doesn't sound heroic. It doesn't fit into reports or headlines. It feels like an excuse, even when it's the truth. As the day wore on, the adrenaline faded. That's when the real exhaustion hit. His shoulders ached. His thoughts slowed. Words took effort. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work, but from carrying responsibility while running on empty. He sat alone later, away from the noise, replaying the moment again. The pen, the paper, the clock. He remembered hesitating, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. Because he knew the margin for error shrinks when the mind is tired. Because he knew sleep deprivation doesn't just steal rest, it steals perspective. But command doesn't wait for perfect conditions. It rarely waits for human limits. That realization stayed with him. Leadership is often described as strength under pressure. But no one talks about strength under exhaustion. About decision-making when your brain is begging you to stop. About responsibility when your body has nothing left to give. The system assumes you will perform anyway. And most of the time you do. But not without cost. Later that evening, when things finally slowed, he allowed himself a question he hadn't asked out loud. How many decisions in history were shaped by fatigue? How many moments labeled bold or reckless were really made by someone who hadn't slept? How many outcomes judged in hindsight were born in rooms filled with silence, pressure, and exhaustion? That thought unsettled him. Because it made the story bigger than one night. It made it human. He finally slept that night, deeply, heavily. The kind of sleep that pulls you under without dreams. When he woke, the world hadn't changed, but he had. He understood something clearly now. Rest is not weakness. Sleep is not luxury. And exhaustion is not a footnote, it's a force. The decision would follow him, but so would the lesson. One he would never forget. That leadership doesn't just require courage. Sometimes, it requires knowing when the mind is too tired to be trusted. And sometimes, the most dangerous pressure isn't the enemy outside. It's the moment when the world demands clarity from someone who hasn't slept. The world noticed before he was ready. By the time he sat down that morning, the decision had already been dissected. Analysts spoke with certainty. Commentators filled the silence with opinions. People far removed from the moment explained what should have been done. They sounded confident. They always do, after the fact. He watched quietly, not to defend himself, but to understand how quickly complexity turns into simplicity once danger has passed. The decision had been reduced to headlines, bullet points, clean narratives. No one mentioned the sleepless night. No one mentioned the clock ticking forward while options disappeared. They judged the outcome, not the condition. Criticism came first, too fast, too slow, too cautious, too aggressive. Each opinion contradicted the last, yet every voice claimed certainty. That was the hardest part, not the blame, but the confidence of people who had never carried the weight of the moment. Praise followed later. Selective praise. The kind that celebrates results while ignoring risk. The kind that rewrites intention based on outcome. If it had gone worse, the story would have changed. If it had gone better, the pressure would have been forgotten. Success erases exhaustion, failure magnifies it. He stayed silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because explaining fatigue sounds weak in a world that rewards certainty. Admitting exhaustion feels like admitting failure, even when the system itself demands decisions beyond human limits. Inside, doubt fought discipline. He replayed alternate paths. Imagined different outcomes. wondered how many variables had been shaped not by strategy, but by a tired mind trying to stay sharp. He recognized something uncomfortable. Some parts of the criticism were fair, others weren't. That was harder to accept. Public judgment is never balanced. It doesn't measure effort, only results. It doesn't ask what it cost, it asks whether it worked. And sometimes that question cuts deeper than blame. Late one evening, long after the noise faded, he sat alone with the reports. Final numbers, final assessments, cold summaries of a moment that had felt anything but cold. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel ashamed. He felt aware. Aware of how fragile clarity becomes under pressure. Aware of how quickly strength can turn into endurance, and endurance into depletion. Aware that leadership is often less about bold moves, and more about surviving moments when the margin for error is thin and the mind is exhausted. That awareness stayed. He began to notice it in others. The hesitation before decisions, the stiffness in posture, the subtle signs of people running on empty, but expected to perform flawlessly. He saw how often fatigue was ignored, minimized, dismissed. Push through, handle it, do your job. No one asked whether the mind was clear enough to decide. The judgment of his decision eventually faded. Another crisis took its place. Another story replaced his. That's how the world works. But the lesson remained. He understood now that the most dangerous moment in any system is not chaos. It's exhaustion disguised as competence. When people look steady but are barely holding on. When experience masks fatigue just well enough to be trusted. He didn't speak publicly about it. He didn't write essays or give interviews. Instead, he changed one thing quietly. He began to slow decisions when possible. He pushed for rest when others resisted. He questioned timelines that ignored human limits. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some saw it as caution. Others saw it as weakness. He knew better. Because he remembered that night. The clock, the pen, the pressure. And he knew how easily history could have shifted, not because of enemy action or flawed strategy, but because someone had been too tired to think clearly. The world will always judge outcomes, but it rarely judges conditions. And that is why so many lessons are learned too late. Time did what it always does. It moved on. New priorities replaced old ones. New crises demanded attention. New decisions filled the space the old one once occupied. To the outside world, that night slowly became just another chapter, important, but finished. For him, it never fully closed. The decision didn't haunt him in loud ways. There were no nightmares, no dramatic breakdowns. Instead, it stayed in the background of his thinking, shaping how he approached every moment that followed. Quietly, persistently, he noticed how often urgency was confused with importance. How quickly leaders were expected to respond, react, decide without pause, without rest, without space to think. Speed was praised. Hesitation was questioned. But he had lived inside hesitation. He knew it wasn't weakness. It was awareness. He began to change how he led, not in ways that attracted attention, but in ways that altered outcomes. Meetings slowed slightly. Questions became more precise. He listened longer than before. Not because he lacked confidence, but because he respected the cost of certainty. When others pushed for immediate decisions, he asked for clarity. When they pushed for speed, he asked about fatigue. Some didn't like it. They were used to decisiveness, not reflection. Used to commands, not considerations. But over time, something subtle happened. Fewer mistakes slipped through. Fewer rushed judgments needed correction. The pressure didn't disappear, but it became manageable. More human. He never told anyone that the shift began with one sleepless night. There was no need. The lesson wasn't meant to be explained. It was meant to be applied. Years later, someone asked him about the decision, not critically, not publicly, just in passing. A casual question about a moment that once carried enormous weight. He paused before answering. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he finally understood what the decision truly represented. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about limits, human limits. He realized then that leadership stories often focus on courage, intelligence, and resolve, but almost never on endurance. Almost never on the toll of sustained pressure. Almost never on the invisible cost of being the one when everyone else sleeps. That cost doesn't show up in records, but it shapes everything. The decision left behind more than an outcome. It left behind a shift in perspective, a respect for rest, a refusal to pretend that exhaustion is strength, and understanding that clear judgment requires more than experience, it requires capacity. He watched new leaders rise, talented, sharp-driven. He recognized the same patterns in them that he once carried himself. The long hours, the constant readiness, the quiet pride in pushing through fatigue. And sometimes, when the moment allowed, he intervened. Not with authority, but with advice. Rest before deciding, he would say. Clarity matters more than speed. Being tired changes everything. Some listened, some didn't. But the words were planted. That, he realized, was the real legacy of the decision. Not the headlines, not the analysis, not the judgment, but the awareness it created. The ripple it sent forward. The moments it quietly protected by preventing another exhausted choice from becoming another irreversible outcome. In the end, the decision didn't define him. What followed did. The restraint, the patience, the understanding that leadership is not about proving strength, but about protecting judgment. And if there was one truth he carried forward, it was this. The world will always demand answers. But wisdom lies in knowing when the mind is too tired to give the right one. That night was never about strategy alone. It was about a human being making a permanent choice while running on empty. No rank, no experience, no discipline can erase the limits of a tired mind. And yet the world keeps demanding perfection from people who haven't slept. The decision stood. History recorded the outcome. But what mattered more was what followed. He learned that strength isn't pushing through exhaustion. It's recognizing when exhaustion is shaping judgment. That speed can impress, but clarity protects. And that leadership is not proven by how fast you decide, but by how wisely you choose to pause. Most people will never know how close things come to breaking in moments like that. They'll judge the result, never the condition. But the lesson remains, quiet and unspoken. Some choices don't fail because they are wrong. They fail because they are made when the mind is too tired to see clearly. And sometimes, that is the most dangerous pressure of all.